International fugitive. Money launderer. Criminal mastermind. John Frances Spiteri.
So, David, let's start off with your latest role. This is, of course, the infamous John Frances Spiteri. Just briefly, tell me, who is he?
Well, John Frances Spiteri is an ex-small-time crim who now is also an ex-junkie. And some people may have met him more than 22 years ago in a film called Gettin Square.
Your name is John Frances Spiteri?
Yeah.
Thank you. And you reside...
I never said it wasn't.
Sorry?
I never.
Never what, Mr. Spiteri?
I never said it wasn't.
And at the end of that film, he left the shores to get clean. So we've made a spin-off, not a sequel, a spin-off, whereby we focus literally on John Frances Spiteri. It's called Spit, and the film starts with Spit returning to Australia after 22 years on a fake passport. And he doesn't get very far, and he gets pulled up by the authorities, and he gets thrown into immigration detention.
Why runs this place?
Oh, mate, that's just a tragic case of mistaken identity. Partners?
This is your driver's license.
No, but it's not me. He's got squinty eyes. I don't have squinty eyes.
But I do want to ask you why this character is so revered, because, like you said, we are talking about an ex-con, an ex-junkie, but you recently told the Weekend Australian magazine that more than any other role, it's become the character that people still come up to me about almost on a daily basis. You said some people who approach you say they've seen it dozens of times.
Yeah.
So why are people so drawn to him?
Yeah, there's a guy that I met last night. He said that he's watched it probably about 50 times. Him and his wife. It's a really curious one. And if I put my thinking cap on to actually have a little think about it, I think it's because at his heart, he is a good man. For all his flaws and idiosyncrasies and faults and quirks, he's genuinely a good man. And he's also, as we find out in this film, he's also the least judgmental person you could ever wish to come across. Doesn't matter what religion you are, what the colour of your skin, how much money you've got, what job you do or don't do. He doesn't care. He's just going to treat you exactly as you come. And this film, essentially, if you ask me what it's about mateship. And at the end of the film, I think people leave the cinema not only feeling, pretty happy and uplifted, but I think they feel as though, wow, I'd really love to be a mate of Spiteri's. He's a genuinely good man, and he endears himself to people. I think they feel for him.
Well, I really wanted to ask you about one scene in particular, which I think really is possibly the most endearing scene. And I mean, of course, this is a comedy. I have to be very clear to the listeners about that. But there was one scene in Spit which absolutely made tears spring to my eyes. It's the scene in which Spit visits his sister in hospital. She's in a bad way. She's also a member of a different outsider community. I'm going to leave it for the moviegoers to discover. But she is in a bad way, and just the way you touch her hair so gently and, the absolutely distraught, the destitute look on your face. I'm just wondering if there was a particular person or experience or relationship that you drew upon to help you to elicit that feeling.
Look, I suppose, in short, the answer is yes. But I think it's a feeling, not to give terribly much away about the film, but it's, it's grief, and we all suffer that throughout our lives. That's part of being human. People are going to, hideous things are going to happen to people, and we all die. So it's not something that is unfamiliar to any of us, and it was something that I could easily access.
I did wonder if you are comfortable to give me any details of what you drew upon, because I was with both my parents when they died, and just your reaction was it really rang true to me. And I just think that the way someone responds when someone is in a very bad way is perhaps different in reality than you might think if you hadn't experienced it.
Yeah, both my parents have passed away. I got to see my mother just before she passed away. And with my mother, when she was laying there about to take her last breath, she was surrounded by her children. I'm the last of 7. And it was literally nearly her last breath when the screen sort of slid open and a lady put her head around the curtain and just asked what my mother might like to eat, whether it be I think it was the chicken soup or something else. And I was like, oh my God, I couldn't script this any better.
You can't
It
write
was
it.
like, comedy and tragedy right at exactly the same second. But in terms of having, we've all had hideous experiences happen to us. I remember years ago I got a phone call. A very good friend of mine, his partner was giving birth, and the child died as she was giving birth, and he asked me to come in and for want of a better word, help with the situation. Yeah. And they wanted me to. I took footprints of that child. Yeah. So they had a record of who, their little child and whatever. And then I was the person who dealt with the situation from them for the next few days. And it was, and I never would have thought that I'd find myself in that situation. It was a very unique human experience.
Just to bring it back to the film, I wanted to ask whether you agreed with the director, Jonathan Toplitsky, because he has said that he thinks Spit is the kind of mythological character, an ordinary man doing his best that Australians like to believe they are. So does that ring true to you? Sort
of, yes. That's how Chris Neist, who's a very successful criminal lawyer on the Gold Coast, would also describe Johnny Spiteri, the little man trying to do his best. And he's got an interesting take as well on it. Being a criminal lawyer, he's of the belief that everybody is a good person. It's only that along the way events may occur or things may happen which will alter them in such a way that they go down another path. But he believes at their core, everybody is a good person, which is a fascinating way to look at people in the world, really.
Now, David, I really want to zoom out a little bit and ask you your take on why Australians broadly reveal underdogs so much, and in particular those with a criminal bent, like John Spiteri. And just to give you a bit of context, I'm obsessed with this because I grew up in Canada. Yep. I've lived here 27 years, but I grew up in Canada, and there we revered classic success stories, hockey stars, Jim Carrey, John Candy. And here, though, we've got Ned Kelly, the Gallipoli soldiers who were slaughtered in what has to be one of Australia's worst losses. Characters like Alan Bond, a convicted criminal. I imagine he's less revered today, but his name's still on a university.
Yeah, no, that's really weird, isn't it? Yeah, money can buy anything, really, can't it?
So I'd love your take, because I've always been obsessed with it. To me, it's very unique about Australia.
It is odd. We made the first feature-length film in the world.
No.
124 years ago.
What was that?
And it was the story of the Kelly Gang.
See, there you go.
There you go. The very first feature film in the world ever made. And it was about a gangster, essentially.
Exactly.
And then we have, Chopper obviously did so well as well. Like a pretty hideous man, in all honesty. It is a fascinating one. And I've got to say, as I get older, I really question why we do actually revere these characters. We embrace them.
Yep.
Yeah, why we do it, I don't know. Maybe it's because, I don't know, maybe it has to do with the way this country was settled or taken, over 200 years ago. I don't know. But I think it's worth having a bit of a rethink about it, because you're right. I think we should celebrate different forms of people.
Yes.
We should celebrate, let's look to the light, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Spit... Yeah, he's not he's an ex-junkie. He's not a sophisticated criminal at all. He's a bit of five-finger discount here and there, and that's about the extent of it, really. But it's an uplifting story, and it's a unifying story.
It is,
and it brings. We had a lady in the audience the other night in Brisbane, and after the screening, she said, "I tell you, at the end of the film, she said, I just wanted to hug the person next to me."
Yes,
which is a pretty amazing thing.
Who?
Lock him up.
This is Australia. It's still a free country, isn't it?
I interviewed your mate, John Casimir. He was your producer on an ABC interview series, the ABC of, where you were in my position interviewing iconic Australians. And he told me that he does think it's our penal colony background here, that, the heroes then were those who rebelled against authority because the authority was pretty awful. So do you think, because that's what he was saying.
Well, that's a really interesting thing, because we look at this film, Spiteri, and there is a bit of anti-authoritarianism there. He is anti-authority.
He is.
And he does sort of win against all odds against the system in many ways. Look, I think I'd agree with John. I'd have to, because he's far brighter than I am.
I mean, and another thing John actually said that I thought was so interesting, that kind of blew my mind, that I hadn't thought of. He said, with regards to that theory, he said, I'm fond of saying, if you go back to 1788, which of course is when he's talking about obviously the British coming, it's only 3.5 lifetimes ago. It's not that long ago.
That's true.
And I thought that was very interesting, because whenever people would bring up this penal convict theory, I used to always think, is that just a cliche that I'm thinking about? Because
it's in the scheme of things, it's relatively recent history. Relatively,
exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you now about whether there's something in your own family background that perhaps plays into your history of playing outsiders or underdogs, because you have played a lot of them. I'm thinking of Doug and Causey. There's Spit. There's even, I guess, the Spartan you played in 300. Father Damien and Molokai.
Yep.
Because your parents were steeped in social justice Catholicism, as I understand it. Your father was a volunteer with St. Vincent's de Paul, I believe, for 50 years. You've gone on to do your own volunteer work, Wayside Chapel, Leprosy Mission Australia. So I'm just wondering whether you think that family background has something to do with what seems to me to be a great empathy for people who, are perhaps forgotten by society or certainly not celebrated.
Well, yeah, look, I'm certainly the product of my upbringing, and my parents have had a huge influence on shaping the person of who I am. Yeah, what my father did, was truly remarkable when I look back on it. He devoted so much of his life to selflessly going out at night and basically dealing with people who are far less privileged than we were. We weren't privileged, though. We were a working class family that didn't have terribly much money, but there were people far worse off than us.
Yeah.
And my father, spent a lot of time trying to assist them as best he could. The underdog thing is really interesting, and I think that actually is an Australian characteristic as well. We do root for the underdog, and that is different to North American culture, where you actually celebrate success.
Totally.
We don't, and we have something that is not exactly the most attractive. Part of our culture is, the tall poppy syndrome. You don't want people to get, too big for their boots. We just chop them down pretty quickly. But rooting for the underdog is, it's a big one. I've got to say, I do. If there's a sporting event that, I just come across, I will instinctively, root for the underdog.
And I did want to ask you about your mother, though. We've spoken about your
Yes.
father, but I was wondering whether your mother, Kathleen, was something of a direct line into feeling empathy for people who, perhaps just aren't lucky enough to be born into the circumstances to achieve their dreams. Because I did read that you once told our mastheads that she was, quote, an extraordinary woman who didn't really get the opportunities she deserved. She was born during World War I. She was bright. She could have gone to university, but that wasn't her lot in life back then.
Yeah, my mother was an extraordinary woman. Yeah, 7 kids. And now, I've got 2 kids, and I honestly can't work out how she actually did it. The time management that my mother put in place was just extraordinary. Not only did she, she feed and clothe us, but she made clothes for us. All kids, all of us.
Really?
She'd sew stuff. Every winter, all of us would get a hand-knitted jumper for the winter.
Really?
Every winter. When I had 5 sisters, 4 of them got married, she made all the wedding dresses. It was like,
Wow.
back in those days, you just did it all. And she made the wedding cake for each of them. Like, I just don't know how she'd manage the time.
Well, I thought this other anecdote I have to ask you about, because I read that she also studied ancient Greek, and there was a time where you were at a butcher with your mother,
That's true.
and he was swearing in Greek, because this was in Marrickville, where you grew up in the inner west of Sydney, and a lot of people spoke Greek, and your mother spoke back to him in Greek, and he dropped the sausages on the sawdust
Yeah, he
floor.
did. Yeah, he was absolutely floored.
Yeah.
That, somebody of her age, Anglo-Saxon, was actually speaking Greek with him.
Exactly.
Yeah, she was amazing. And then then later in life, she hadn't gone overseas. But neither of my parents had actually got on a plane.
Yes.
Till probably well after they were 60. And
Wow.
then,
Common.
not even on one plane, not even domestically.
Yes.
And then my mother took it up, and she would go on these incredible adventures through an adult literacy group she went away with, and followed female writers throughout.
Wow. So she got
the
her
UK.
opportunities.
Yeah, she did. But it's
Later.
like, in a way, you think, oh my God, if she was around these days, what she may have achieved, other than she would loved being a mother and an incredible parent, but the opportunities in terms of other things for herself.
Okay. Well, I want to wrap up, and it's a bit of a attack to the left, because, and I guess it does touch on empathy for others and compassion, because there is one element to this film, it's a very strong element, and we haven't touched on it yet. And it is, of course, that Spit ends up in a detention center. He's been away overseas, been on the run for 20 years, comes back to Australia with a false passport. He's in detention with people who, refugees from countries where some of them we learn have had just horrific experiences, suffering and murder that they have fled. And I was just wanting to find out if, this is something that you felt strongly about, and, are perhaps they the forgotten underdogs in Australia that maybe we should turn our sights to?
Oh, undoubtedly. That was as I mentioned to you the very first time I read the draft of this script, I thought Chris's the reason for bringing Spit back was inspired, and it has to do with where he ends up as soon as he lands in Australia. Chris, and the idea for that came many years ago. Chris just couldn't understand the huge hullabaloo in this country about migration. He just thought he just couldn't understand it. He said, look, I'm a migrant. He said, we're all migrants, or we're products of migrants. He just didn't get it. So he thought about it for a while, and he thought, I know, I'll just drop Johnny Spiteri into the middle of this and see what comes from it. And that was the impetus to bring Spit back. And as I mentioned before, we find out that Johnny Spiteri, for all his quirks and flaws, you find out that guy is the least judgmental person.
Yeah.
And he will take anybody just for who they are. And in the film, the characters who play the refugees in the film, most of them are actually refugees themselves, or they are the offspring of refugees. And we held like a casting session, and we met these people who literally the session began with them basically telling us their stories, which were, as you can imagine, some of them quite horrific. And then we just had them improvising with each other. Every person in that film who is a refugee loved the fact that this was a comedy, which is really, really interesting.
That's interesting.
They said for the first time ever, they said it humanises us. They said previous depictions of us on screen were always painted with a very broad brushstroke and nearly often sometimes deified as well. And they said, that's not the case. They said, we are the same as everybody else. We just happen to be refugees. And they love the fact that, some of us are really smart, some of us are intelligent, some of us aren't. Some of us are absolute idiots. And it's like, they fought about, who was going to be the biggest idiot on the screen. And they loved that. And that's been one of the great joys of seeing audiences watch this film and laugh with them. There's no punching down at all in this film.
No, absolutely not.
It's and there's no political message in it. Haven't made a political film. It is a comedy that actually is a unifying thing that makes us celebrate the best of humanity.
Well, I think I can speak for a lot of listeners when I say, we're so grateful that you do take on these roles, because they help us understand humanity better. Hopefully they enable people to have a bit more compassion. So thank you so much, David, for your time.
I've loved talking with you. Thank you so much.